The sky over Iloria cracked like fragile glass. Once a vibrant blue-green dome, filled with the soft shimmer of bioluminescent clouds, it was now dull, streaked with toxic gray. Beneath it, the once flourishing lands of Iloria lay in ruins. Its crystalline forests had turned brittle, their shimmering branches crumbling into lifeless dust. Rivers that had once glowed with liquid sapphire now bubbled with dark, poisonous sludge. The air itself was a suffocating weight, filled with a haze that dimmed the light of Iloria's twin suns. The Ilorians, a people known for their luminous skin and glowing patterns that changed with emotion, were dying. Their breath grew shallow. Their light dimmed. Their songs, once echoing in harmony across their cities, had fallen silent. Desperation filled the air, but no Ilorian could find the words to say what they all feared. Their world was ending. Illyra, the planet's most brilliant scientist, sat alone in her laboratory, staring at a broken shard of crystal. The shard, though tiny, contained the last hope of her people, a map of ancient knowledge carved into its surface. For years, Illyra had searched for answers, her fingers tracing the delicate patterns etched by her ancestors. Her mind, sharp and unrelenting, worked tirelessly to decipher their meaning. But today, her hands trembled. She had found the answer at last, but it was almost too much to bear. "It cannot be true," she whispered, her glowing eyes wide. Her markings dimmed, reflecting the deep conflict within her. The shard told a story of an ancient alliance. Long ago, before Iloria had even learned to build its first cities, another race had walked among the stars. They called themselves humans. These humans had been explorers, creators, and mentors to many worlds. They had shared their knowledge generously, but with power came arrogance, and in time, their civilization had collapsed. The records on the shard suggested that humans were now scattered, forgotten, and diminished. But it wasn't their history that made Illyra's breath catch. It was the shard's final revelation. The human's blood held the key to Iloria's salvation. The crystal forests and glowing rivers of Iloria had not been a natural miracle. They were the result of ancient genetic bonds shared between Ilorians and humans. Over millennia, Iloria's people had evolved, but their planet had not. The delicate balance was breaking, and only pure human DNA could restore it. Illyra clenched the shard tightly in her hand, her bioluminescent markings flashing in patterns of guilt and hope. Could it be true? Could salvation lie in the veins of a species thought extinct beyond Earth? "Illyra," a soft voice interrupted. She turned to see her assistant, Corin, standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his markings dim. Even the strongest among them were fading. "Have you found something?" he asked, his voice hopeful yet weary. Illyra hesitated. She wanted to tell him the truth, but she feared what it would mean. The Ilorians were not warriors. They had always lived in harmony, avoiding conflict. Yet to save their world, they might have to venture far beyond their dying planet, into the unknown. "Yes," she finally said, her voice steady. "But it's not simple." Corin stepped closer, his dim markings pulsing faintly. "What must we do?" "We must find a human," Illyra replied. "One who can give us what we need." Corin's face fell. "A human. But they're gone, aren't they? We've only heard stories, legends." Illyra nodded. "Legends, yes. But legends often hold truth. The shard says they still exist, scattered among the stars. We must find them, or our world is lost." Corin stared at her for a long moment. Finally, he said, "How do we begin? Where do we even look?" Illyra walked to a large ancient map projected on the wall. It was incomplete, with wide gaps in its star charts, but there were marks, places the shard had highlighted as significant. "We start here," Illyra said, pointing to a small, unremarkable system at the edge of the galaxy. "There are whispers of a colony. If the shard is right, there might still be humans there. It's our only chance." Corin's markings flared with a mix of determination and fear. "Then we go. But if we fail?" Illyra interrupted, her voice firm. We cannot fail. If we do, there will be nothing left to save. As she spoke, the laboratory trembled. Another toxic storm was brewing outside, tearing through what little remained of Eloria's fragile atmosphere. The world was dying faster than she had feared. Elira clenched her fist around the shard, its edges biting into her palm. This was it. The search for humanity would begin, and with it, the last hope for her people. On the barren mining colony of Terra's IV, life was a struggle. The air was thin, the ground cracked, and the stars above seemed distant and cold. Cal had never known a world where things were easy. Born into hardship, he had learned early on that survival meant working hard, trusting few, and never expecting anything more than the next meal. Cal was a miner, a scavenger of metals, working deep beneath the planet's surface. He was tall and strong, with hands calloused from years of labor, and his eyes always seemed to carry the weight of the world. Most of his fellow colonists had given up hope long ago. They worked their shifts in silence, barely speaking to each other, resigned to the harshness of life. Cal, however, kept to himself. He had never seen the point in making connections when tomorrow might not come. One evening, as Cal finished his shift, a strange hum filled the air, different from the usual sounds of the mining equipment. The ground shook slightly beneath his boots, and he looked up, squinting against the dust-filled sky. The sound grew louder until a massive craft descended from the heavens, its shape sleek and shining, like a blade cutting through the stormy clouds. The ship landed with a thud that sent ripples through the dust. The miners stopped, staring. It wasn't every day that something this big came to Terra's IV. In fact, it never happened. The colony had been isolated for decades, forgotten by most of the galaxy. As the dust settled, a figure appeared at the entrance of the ship, a woman, tall, with glowing skin and markings that shimmered faintly in the dying light of the day. She was not from Terra's IV. She looked otherworldly. Cal watched from the shadows, skeptical and curious. He had heard stories of strange visitors from the stars, but he had never believed them. Who would come to a place like this? The woman's eyes scanned the crowd, her gaze finally locking onto Cal. She walked toward him, her steps confident, her every movement graceful despite the harshness of the world around them. "You are Cal, are you not?" Her voice was clear, musical, and somehow soothing. Cal didn't answer right away. His mind raced. How could she know his name? He had never met her, and no one from his past had sent word of visitors. "Yes, I'm Cal," he said cautiously, his voice rough from years of labor. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "I am Elira," she replied, her eyes full of quiet urgency. "I come from the planet Eloria, and I need your help." Cal raised an eyebrow, taking a step back. "Help? You've got the wrong person. I'm just a miner. There's nothing I can do for you." Elira's glowing eyes softened. "I understand your reluctance, but the truth is, your people are the key to saving my world." Cal frowned, his suspicion growing. "My people? What do you mean by that?" Elira's gaze turned serious. She motioned for him to follow her, and Cal reluctantly complied, drawn by the intensity in her eyes. They walked to a nearby outpost, where the quiet buzz of activity had returned to normal. There, Elira took out a small glowing crystal. She held it out to Cal, and as soon as he touched it, the images and words of an ancient language flooded his mind. He gasped, pulling his hand back. "What was that? What are you doing to me?" "I'm showing you the truth," Elira said, her voice calm but filled with the weight of years of suffering. "The blood of humans is the key to saving Meloria. A special bond exists between your people and mine. We share a history, one that was lost long ago. Eloria is dying, Cal, and only your blood can heal it." Cal stared at her, his thoughts spinning. He had heard nothing of this before. The idea of being part of some ancient prophecy was too much to process. "I don't know anything about this," Cal said, shaking his head. "I'm just a miner. I have nothing to do with prophecies or ancient bonds. Elira took a deep breath, then spoke in a low, steady voice. I understand your doubts, but I promise you, this is not a trick. We have searched for years, across galaxies, for a human like you. And you are the only one who can help. The future of my people rests in your hands. Kale looked at her, his heart heavy. He had never asked for this, never wanted any part in saving the world of another. His world was Terrace IV, and it had enough problems of its own. But why me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because your blood is pure, Elira replied. And Iloria's salvation requires a pure source of life, untouched by the corruption that has tainted so much of the galaxy. Kale stood in silence, staring at her. The weight of her words sank deep into him. This wasn't some chance meeting. This was fate, a call he couldn't ignore. I'll think about it, Kale finally said, his mind racing. But I'm not making any promises. Elira's face softened with a quiet relief. That's all I ask, Kale. Just think about it. Time is running out. As she turned to leave, Kale remained rooted to the spot, the hum of the strange ship now a distant sound. He didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain. His life would never be the same again. Kale had never been one for space travel. The idea of leaving the familiar dust and rocks of Terra's IV, of being surrounded by nothing but the vast, empty void of space, unsettled him. He had always been grounded, both in his work and in his life. But as he stood in the hangar, staring up at the sleek ship that would carry him away from everything he knew, he couldn't deny the pull of curiosity. The ship, Luminous Grace, was nothing like anything he had seen before. Its smooth silver hull shimmered under the harsh lights of the hangar. Long, curved wings jutted from its sides, and glowing lines of energy ran across its surface. Even the way it hovered above the ground, as if weightless, filled Kale with awe and unease. He had never imagined a ship like this existed, let alone one that would take him across the stars. Inside the ship, the air was fresh and cool, a welcome change from the dust-choked atmosphere of Terra's IV. Kale's boots made no sound as he followed Elira through the quiet halls, their footsteps swallowed by the soft, humming energy of the ship's core. The walls were lined with strange panels, covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with life. It was clear that Luminous Grace was a ship like no other, advanced beyond anything Kale could have ever dreamed. Elira led him to a small cabin, simple but functional. A bed, a desk, and a chair were the only furnishings, but the room itself felt peaceful, as if it had been designed for comfort rather than luxury. This will be your space for the journey, Elira said as she stepped inside. We will be traveling for some time, and it's best you get used to the ship. Kale nodded but didn't sit down. He was too restless, his mind still caught on everything Elira had told him. The idea of saving an entire planet, of being the key to its survival, weighed heavily on his shoulders. But there was more to it than that. He had learned so much since meeting Elira. Iloria was a planet unlike any he could have imagined. Its people, with their glowing skin and delicate features, were beautiful and fragile. They lived in harmony with nature, a harmony that had been shattered by time, by greed, and by their own inability to protect their world. Kale couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility, even though he wasn't sure he was the right person for the job. I still don't understand, Kale said, turning to face Elira. Why me? Why not someone else? There have to be others who are better suited for this. Elira's eyes softened, her glowing markings flickering like the light of distant stars. You don't understand, Kale. It's not about being better or more skilled. It's about the bond between our people. Our species share a deep connection that goes back to the beginning of time. Your blood, your genetics, are what can heal Iloria. It's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of fate. Kale frowned, his brow furrowing as he thought about her words. I don't feel like anything special. I'm just a miner. How can I possibly help save a whole planet? You are special, Elira said softly, her gaze intense. You just don't know it yet. The words hung in the air between them, and Cale wasn't sure what to make of them. He didn't feel special. He was just a man from a dusty colony, a place most people in the galaxy had never even heard of. But there was something in Elira's eyes that made him question everything he knew about himself. Maybe there was more to him than he thought. The journey was long, with days stretching into weeks as the luminous grace traveled through the cold emptiness of space. Cale spent much of the time in his cabin, looking out at the stars through the small window, lost in his thoughts. The ship's advanced systems took care of most things, and the crew, mostly Lorians, seemed quiet and reserved, as if they were all waiting for something. Cale and Elira spoke often, but their conversations were usually about the mission, about Loria's condition, and about the strange, ancient knowledge stored in the ship's databanks. Elira shared more about her planet, about its history, its culture, and its slow decline. She also spoke of the prophecy, the ancient story that foretold the return of humans to save the Valorians. But there was something in her voice, something almost sad, that made Cale wonder if they were all just clinging to a story, a hope that had faded long ago. One evening, as the ship passed through the edge of a distant star system, Elira called Cale to the observation deck. The view was breathtaking, a swirling nebula of purple and blue gas, lit by the dim light of a nearby star. The colors shifted and changed as they moved, creating an ever-changing canvas of light and shadow. This is the galaxy you are a part of, Cale, Elira said, her voice soft. It's vast, full of mysteries and wonders, but it's also fragile. All of it can be lost if we do not act. Cale looked out at the nebula, trying to take it all in. The stars seemed so distant, yet so close. He had never imagined a world beyond his own. And now, it was as if the universe had opened up to him in ways he couldn't fully understand. We are close, Elira added, her voice tinged with hope. Soon, we will reach Eloria. And when we do, everything will change. Cale turned to face her, a new sense of determination stirring in his chest. The path ahead was uncertain, and the weight of it all still felt heavy. But for the first time, he understood that this journey was not just about saving Eloria. It was about saving everything. His world, her world, and the legacy of humanity itself. The stars finally began to fade as luminous grace entered the atmosphere of Eloria. Cale stood at the observation window, his eyes wide with awe as the planet grew larger in the view. From space, Eloria looked like a jewel, its surface a mix of glowing blue oceans, bright green forests, and vast, shimmering plains. The planet's twin suns cast a soft glow over the land, painting it in hues of orange and purple. This is it. Elira's voice was soft beside him. This is where we must make our stand. Cale didn't respond immediately. He couldn't take his eyes off the world below. There was something hauntingly beautiful about it, something fragile, like it was a place that had once known life, and was now clinging to the last remnants of its existence. The ship descended slowly, breaking through the clouds, and landed gently on a wide open plain, the grass beneath it shimmering with the same glowing light that ran through Elira's markings. Cale took a deep breath, stepping off the ship and feeling the air around him. It was unlike anything he had ever known, fresh, clean, and full of life. There was a weight to the atmosphere, as if the planet itself was breathing in time with him. Elira walked ahead, her movements graceful and purposeful. She led Cale through the fields toward a distant city, its structures towering and shining. But even from this distance, Cale could see that they were cracked, worn by time, and the steady erosion of the planet's energy. We've built too much, Elira said quietly, her eyes on the city. Our cities were once full of life, full of light, but we've pushed our world too far, and now it's dying. Cale followed her, feeling a strange sense of sadness for the planet and its people. He had heard stories of planets lost to war, to neglect, but seeing the evidence of it firsthand left him feeling helpless. As they approached the city gates, a group of Elorians greeted them. They were dressed in simple, flowing robes, their glowing skin dimmer than Elira's, their eyes tired and filled with worry. Kel couldn't help but notice the way they looked at Elira, like she was their last hope, their savior. One of the Lilorians stepped forward, his voice low but filled with reverence. "Elira, you've returned. Is it true? Has the human come?" Elira nodded. "Yes. This is Kel. He is the one who will help save us." Kel's stomach churned at the weight of her words. He had never asked to be a hero. He had never asked to be the one to save anyone, let alone an entire planet. But the eyes of the Lilorians were filled with such desperate hope that he couldn't bring himself to turn away. The group led them through the city, past crumbling buildings and overgrown streets. The city had once been a place of beauty and innovation, but now it felt abandoned, forgotten by time. Kel noticed the way the Lilorians moved, their steps slow and tired, as if they were all waiting for something to change, waiting for a miracle. This city was once the heart of Eloria, Elira explained as they walked. It was the center of knowledge, of culture. Now, it's a shadow of its former self. Kel looked around, seeing the truth in her words. The buildings, once filled with light, now seemed dark and empty. The streets that should have been full of people were nearly deserted. The energy that had once powered this city, that had given it life, was gone. "We've tried everything," Elira continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've tried to fix it with technology, with science, with magic. But nothing works. Only the human blood can restore what has been lost." Kel felt a knot in his stomach. He had agreed to come here, to help, but he had no idea what they expected from him. His blood. What did that even mean? The group stopped in front of a large building at the center of the city. Its doors were wide open, and inside, a great hall stretched out before them. The walls were lined with old tapestries, faded with age, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. "This is the Hall of the Ancients," Elira said as they entered. "It is here that our ancestors first discovered the bond between our people. It is here that we will perform the ritual to restore Eloria." Kel's heart raced. A ritual? What kind of ritual? Elira led him to the center of the hall, where a large stone pedestal stood. It was covered in intricate markings, and Kel could feel a strange energy emanating from it. He stepped forward, his mind racing. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What do you need from me?" Elira turned to him, her face filled with both sadness and hope. "We need you to give us your blood, Kel. Only then can we use the ancient knowledge to heal Eloria." Kel stared at her, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. The fate of an entire world rested in his hands, and all it would take was a single drop of his blood. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elira stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "You can. You are the one who was chosen. You are the one who will save us." For a moment, Kel stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The room around him seemed to close in, the pressure of their expectations building. But then, something inside him stirred, a sense of duty, of responsibility. He had come this far, and now there was no turning back. With a deep breath, Kel nodded. "I'll do it." And with that, the ceremony began. The Hall of the Ancients was silent except for the soft hum of energy that pulsed through the walls. Kel stood in the center of the room, his heart racing. He was surrounded by the ancient symbols carved into the stone floor, each one glowing faintly, like forgotten stars. The air felt thick with expectation. The Ilorians watched him, their eyes filled with hope, but also with an edge of desperation. Elira stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. Her glowing skin flickered with the same nervous energy that stirred in Kel's chest. She had explained the ritual to him, but the details felt distant and unclear. The only thing he understood for sure was that his blood, his very essence, was the key to saving this dying world. "Are you ready, Kel?" Elira asked, her voice soft but steady. Cale swallowed hard. Ready? He didn't know if he could ever truly be ready for something like this. But as he looked around the room at the Ilorians, each one holding their breath, waiting for the moment to unfold, he knew that there was no turning back. "I guess I have no choice," he muttered. Elira's eyes softened, filled with understanding. "You do have a choice. But sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead to the greatest change." With that, Elira stepped back, and the others gathered around in a circle, forming a protective ring. The room seemed to come alive as the Ilorians began to chant in a language Cale couldn't understand, their voices low and melodic. The sounds reverberated through the hall, vibrating in his bones, making him feel as if the very air was alive with power. Cale took a deep breath and raised his hand, his fingers trembling. On the pedestal in front of him lay an ancient blade, its surface dull with age, but sharp enough to draw blood. Cale's pulse quickened as he realized what was about to happen. He had to offer his blood willingly, as part of the ritual. It was the only way to unlock the ancient power buried deep within Meloria's history. With a steadying breath, Cale grasped the blade. The cold metal felt foreign against his skin, but he steadied his hand and drew it across his palm, cutting deeply. A sharp pain shot through his body, but he barely flinched. His blood began to pool in his hand, bright red against his rough skin. The moment the first drop of blood fell onto the stone pedestal, the ground beneath them rumbled. A low, deep sound filled the hall, and Cale felt a surge of energy shoot through his veins. It was like nothing he had ever felt before, hot, sharp, and powerful. He clenched his teeth, fighting against the feeling that threatened to overwhelm him. This wasn't just his blood. It was something ancient, something that connected him to this place in a way he didn't yet understand. As the blood spread across the pedestal, the ancient symbols on the floor began to glow brighter, their light becoming more intense. The Ilorians chanted faster now, their voices rising in unison, as if urging the ritual to its final moments. Cale could feel their energy wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the ritual, binding his blood to the world around him. "Hold steady," Elira's voice came, clear and strong above the chanting. "This is only the beginning." Cale's vision blurred as the power intensified. His body felt as if it was being pulled in all directions, stretched thin by the weight of the ritual. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, and the blood in his veins seemed to burn with a fiery intensity. He wanted to pull away, to stop the pain, but Elira's words echoed in his mind. "This is only the beginning." The pedestal suddenly glowed with an intense light, blinding Cale for a moment. The pain in his body flared, and for a heartbeat, he thought he might collapse. But then, just as quickly as the light appeared, it vanished. The energy surged through his body one last time before it settled into a calm, steady rhythm. Cale took a deep breath, his body still trembling with the aftereffects of the ritual. His palm throbbed where the blade had cut him, but the pain was no longer sharp. It was a dull reminder of what had just happened. He looked down at his hand, and for the first time, he saw it. A faint, glowing mark had appeared in the center of his palm, shaped like an ancient symbol. It pulsed gently, as though alive. "What's this?" Cale asked, his voice hoarse. Elira stepped forward, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The bond is complete. Your blood has awakened the power of Meloria." The others stepped forward, their faces filled with awe and reverence. The Ilorians who had been chanting were now silent, their gazes fixed on Cale. The energy in the room had shifted. It was no longer filled with desperation. Now it was filled with hope. Cale looked around at them, still trying to grasp what had just happened. He had given a part of himself, something that had connected him to this ancient planet in ways he didn't understand. But somehow he felt the weight of it in his bones. Iloria was healing, and he had played a role in it. The power in his blood had awakened something deep within the planet, something that had been dormant for centuries. "This is just the beginning," Elira said softly. There is much more to be done. But you have given us the hope we needed, Hale. You have given us a chance. Cale nodded, though he still felt like a stranger in this world, unsure of what the future held. The road ahead was long, and the challenges would be great. But for the first time since stepping onto the ship, he felt a spark of something deep inside him. A sense of purpose, a sense that maybe he wasn't just a miner from Terra's IV. Maybe he was something more. The city of Eloria was not the same after the ritual. In the days that followed Cal's blood offering, something changed in the air. The faint glow that had been missing from the streets began to return, slowly at first, like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. The plants that had withered and died began to show signs of life, their leaves unfurling and their colors brightening. Even the people seemed to breathe easier, their movements more energetic, as if they had been awakened from a long sleep. Cale spent the next few days in a daze, still coming to terms with what had happened. It felt as though the ritual had taken more from him than just a drop of blood. It had taken a piece of his soul, too. Yet, when he looked around at the changes taking place, he couldn't deny that it was worth it. Eloria was alive again, and so were the people who called it home. Elira was always by his side, guiding him through the changes. She spoke little, but the pride in her eyes spoke volumes. Every time Cale caught her gaze, he saw a flicker of something new, something he had never noticed before. She wasn't just the leader of her people. She was their beacon of hope, and Cale had become a part of that hope. One evening, as the twin suns began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elira took Cale to the heart of the city. The central square was alive with activity. People were gathering around, talking in hushed voices, their faces filled with cautious optimism. The towering structures that had once been signs of decay now stood tall again, their bright surfaces gleaming in the fading light. "This is where it all began," Elira said, gesturing to the square. "Our ancestors built this city as a symbol of unity, of progress. But over time, we lost sight of what mattered most. We became consumed by our own advancements, our own need for control." Cale nodded, taking in the bustling scene around him. He had heard bits and pieces of Eloria's history from Elira, but seeing it firsthand was different. This was a world with a past, a culture rich with wisdom and ambition. Yet, it was also a world scarred by its own mistakes. "Do you think it's possible to fix everything?" Cale asked, his voice quiet. Elira turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I believe that with your help, we have a chance." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Cale wasn't sure what kind of help he could offer beyond what he had already done. His blood had healed the planet, yes, but he wasn't a scientist, nor a healer. He was just a man who had stumbled into something far greater than he could have imagined. Elira seemed to sense his doubt. "The ritual was only the beginning," she continued. "We must now rebuild what has been lost. The land, the knowledge, the bonds between our people. It will take time, but we are not alone. You are with us." Cale looked around at the Ilorians who had gathered, their faces filled with a mix of uncertainty and hope. They were willing to trust him, to believe in him, despite the fact that he was an outsider, someone who had never known their world until now. "Where do we start?" Cale asked, his voice steady now. He had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. Elira smiled, a rare and beautiful expression. "We start with the land," she said. "The first step is to restore our connection to it. Our people have long relied on the energy of the earth, but we lost that bond when we began to focus too much on technology. We need to return to our roots." The journey was not an easy one. Cale followed Elira and the other Elorians to a sacred grove deep in the heart of the planet. The grove was untouched by the damage that had plagued the cities, a place where nature still thrived. The trees were tall and ancient, their roots reaching deep into the earth, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh leaves and damp earth. "This is where our ancestors drew their strength," Elira explained as they entered the grove. The bond between the people of Eloria and the land is ancient. It is what kept us strong for centuries. But we lost it when we became disconnected. Kale stepped forward, feeling a strange pull in his chest. The air was thick with energy, the kind of energy that he had felt during the ritual. It was the same power that had surged through him when his blood had touched the pedestal. Here, in the heart of the grove, that energy felt stronger, alive, pulsing with possibility. Elira knelt beside a large stone in the center of the grove, her fingers tracing the ancient markings etched into its surface. "This stone is a symbol of our connection to the earth," she said. "It was used in the old rituals to channel the energy of the planet. If we can awaken it, we can restore the balance." Kale crouched beside her, his hand hovering over the stone. The markings glowed faintly under his touch, and for a moment, he felt something stir inside him, a deep connection to the world beneath his feet. It was as if the planet itself was speaking to him, asking for help, urging him to continue the work he had started. "We must offer something in return," Elira said, her voice low. "The land will not give without a sacrifice. You have already given your blood. Now we must offer our will, our commitment to protect and heal Eloria." Kale nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had given his blood, but now he had to give something more. He had to commit to this world, to these people, if they were to survive. The energy around them seemed to hum with anticipation. Kale closed his eyes, placing his hand fully on the stone, and allowed himself to connect with the planet. He felt its pulse, its pain, but also its strength, its will to survive. And as he did, he made a promise, not just to Eloria, but to himself. He would see this through. He would help them rebuild, no matter the cost. The days that followed Cal's commitment to Eloria felt like a new beginning. The bond between the people and their planet had been restored, but the road ahead was long. With Cal's help, the Eilorians began working tirelessly to rebuild their world, starting with the land. The sacred grove that had once held the energy of their ancestors now hummed with life again, as the Eilorians reclaimed their connection to it. Cal had become an unexpected leader in this journey. He was no longer just an outsider, a miner from Terra's Sci-Fi. He was now part of the Eilorian family, part of a mission to heal a world on the brink of collapse. Every day, he worked alongside Elira and the others, planting seeds, tending to the earth, and working to restore the balance that had been lost for so long. As the weeks passed, Hale began to notice more changes. The once dying crops in the fields started to grow stronger. The trees that had been wilting now stood tall and proud. The city, too, began to come back to life. The cracks in the buildings healed, the streets once again filled with people. A sense of renewal spread through the land like wildfire, and Cal could feel it. Eloria was waking up. One evening, as Cal stood in the city square, watching the setting sun paint the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, Elira joined him. Her presence was always calming, a reminder of the strength that still lived within Eloria. "How do you feel?" Elira asked, her voice gentle but filled with curiosity. Cal took a deep breath, his eyes on the horizon. "I feel like this is where I'm meant to be," he said quietly, "like I finally found my place." Elira smiled, her eyes sparkling. "I knew you would. It was always here, Cal. You just needed to see it." The words settled in his heart. He had come to Eloria with no real purpose, just a man looking for something more than a life spent in the mines. But now, with every day that passed, he found himself more and more at peace with the path he had taken. Eloria was healing, and so was he. Over time, Cal and Elira grew closer. Their bond, once formed by necessity, had deepened into something more. Cal admired Elira's strength and wisdom, and in return, she saw in him the same courage and dedication that had kept her people alive for centuries. They were no longer just allies in a battle for survival. They were partners, bound by a shared mission to protect and rebuild Eloria. One day, after a long day of work in the fields, Elira took Cal to the high cliffs that overlooked the ocean. The wind was cool against their skin, and the sound of the waves crashing below echoed in the distance. "Do you ever wonder what the future holds?" Elira asked, her gaze distant. Cal looked out over the vast expanse of ocean, the setting sun casting a golden glow across the water. "All the time," he said. "But I think I'm starting to realize that it's not about knowing what's ahead. It's about building something worth fighting for." Elira turned to him, her face serious but filled with hope. "And we have something worth fighting for now." Cal nodded. They both knew how fragile their world had once been, how close they had come to losing it all. But now, as the days passed, Eloria was growing stronger. They were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. In the months that followed, Cal and Elira led the Elorians through the process of restoring their cities, their culture, and their way of life. They found new ways to combine technology with nature, using the energy of the planet in harmony with their advances. The knowledge that had been lost over time was rediscovered, passed down through generations, and shared freely among the people. Cal had become more than just a hero. He had become a symbol of hope, not just for Eloria, but for every world that had ever faced the threat of destruction. His blood had sparked the renewal of this planet, but it was his heart, his will, that would carry it forward. And as Elira stood by his side, watching the progress unfold, she knew that they had built something lasting. It wasn't just a new future for Eloria. It was a new way of life. A life where the people worked together, where they respected the planet and each other. They had learned from the past, and they were determined not to repeat its mistakes. Cal had come to Eloria expecting to do something small, but he had ended up changing the fate of an entire world. He had found his place, and in doing so, he had helped a dying planet bloom once more. As the twin suns set that evening, casting long shadows across the land, Cal and Elira stood together, watching the future unfold before them. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if the universe itself was giving them a sign. They had saved Eloria, and now it was time to build something even greater, a future where the bond between the people and their world would never again be broken. Together, they had found hope, and together, they would protect it, for as long as the stars continued to shine.